Yeah, welcome. I hope you enjoy a good, fun little time in Glastonbury Romance with me today. So, when last we left, Mary and John, cousins, I'll remind you, were on a boat on a river, and Mary had just jumped off to go exploring the area, and John was staying in the boat. When she was gone, he thought to himself, "It's the way she parts her hair and pulls it back and twists it that I like so well. Who would have guessed that I'd find her like this the first minute I got to my native land?" He frowned a little and then closed his eyes. Though it was warm enough to be May rather than March, it was too early for that confusing murmur of insects which is the usual background for a hot afternoon. When the rustling of her steps died away, an incredible silence descended on the place. The newborn reeds were too young to play with the flowing river. The noon had become afternoon. The larks were silent. The fish had ceased to rise. There was no swallows yet, and the few spring flies that hovered over that weedy ditch were safe from attack, whether from the firmament above or the firmament below. The only sound that reached his ears was the sound of a faint trickle of water, which came from some infinitesimal ledge in the bank above his head and fell down drop by drop into the ditch. Not a breath of wind stirred. Not a leaf bud quivered. Not a grass blade swayed. There was only that elfin waterfall, and, except for that, the very earth herself seemed to have fallen asleep. "This is Norfolk," he said to himself, and in that intense, indrawn silence, some old atavistic affiliation with fen ditches, and fen water, and fen peat tugged at his soul and pulled it earthward. And there came to his nostrils, as he lay with his eyes shut, a far-flung, acrid, aromatic smell. It was not the smell of mud, or leaf buds, or grass roots, or cattle dropping, or ditch water. It was not the smell of last night's rain, or of the sleeping south wind. It reached him independent of the eel slime that still slung about the bottom of the boat. It was the smell of East Anglica itself. It was the smell to greet which, on accounted spring mornings, his Isle of Valley ancestors had left their beds and opened their back doors. It was a smell that had come wandering over the water meadows on afternoons like this, to the drowsy heads of innumerable John Crows, resting from their plowing with their ale mugs in their blistered hands, and their minds running on ewes and lambs and on bawdy Cambridge taverns. A fleeting thought of what lay before him in Glastonbury no sooner touched his mind than he flung it away as Mary had flung the eel's head. He made a feeble attempt to recall the subtle idea which he had when he prayed to his mother under the alders, but he could only remember the part about never competing. Compete? He thought vaguely. What does compete mean? At that moment there seemed nothing in the world comparable to allowing sleep to steal through and become one with him, just as this tinkling rivulet he listened to lost itself in the body of this ditch. But all the while, though he kept yielding to these invasions of sleep, he could not give himself up to it to the point of losing his consciousness. Even now and then, when his eyelids still unclosed a little, he saw a drooping willow shoot trailing in the ditch beside him. Its extremity seen through the water was different from the upper part of it seen through the air, and as something in him refused to yield to unconsciousness, he came by degrees to identify himself with this trailing shoot. There was a queer imperative upon him not to sink any deeper into sweet oblivion. There was an imperative upon him to remember his vow about competing. This never competing became identified with the slow swirl of the ditch stream as it made tiny ripples round the suspended chute. He was allowed, he dimly felt, to enjoy his paradisiac lassitude, as long as he, this being, who was partly John Crow and partly a willow shoot, kept those ripples in mind. All these phenomena made up a complete world, and in this world he was fulfilling all his moral obligations and fulfilling them with a delicious sense of virtue merely by keeping these ripples in mind. And the drip-drop of the tinkling rivulet at his elbow was the voice of the queer imperative which he obeyed. A moorhen propelling herself in quaint jerks past this willow shoot towards the river was so startled by confronting the face of a man staring with flickering eyelid down into the water that she rose from it with a scream and flapped off heavily into the rushes. This aroused John, who in a moment forgot altogether the imperative of the tinkling rivulet, and, clutching the edge of the boat with numb, sleep-swollen fingers, raised his neck like a turtle and pricked up his ears to listen for his girl's return. It was under a great ash tree in the center of the neighboring field that they finally had their lunch. "Why didn't you stand up to Philip more if you disliked him so?" she asked when their meal was over and they were recalling last night's gathering. His face worked expressively before his words came out in answer, a curious pulse appearing in his cheeks at the corner of his nostrils, and a certain twitching around his cheekbones. It was a facial peculiarity not quite the same as that of Miss Elizabeth Crowe, and it was evidently a family trait. Touching in the women, and no doubt often a signal of danger in the men, this facial sign, like a well-worn coin, must have frequently, in the last 300 or 400 years, gone to Norwich for the fair, gone to Cambridge to buy books and silk dresses, appeared in the depths of old-fashioned looking-glasses, above mahogany Chester drawers, before the pushing open of innumerable ivy-shadowed front bedroom windows to watch visitors come over the home meadows. It must often have been the last of all their possessions that they were forced to leave behind, when, like William Crowe on this beautiful March day, they lay with 6 feet of East Anglican clay above them. It appeared now indeed more emphatically than Mary had ever seen it in any of her relatives' faces, except once, when she had asked her grandfather at breakfast, as he dreamily looked out over that smooth, secluded lawn, what the words "whore" meant. "I'll tell you exactly why," John cried, seizing a clump of soft moss just beyond where his overcoat extended, with excited fingers. "It is for a reason that I wouldn't tell anyone in the world but you. It's because I've long ago decided always to yield to my cowardice. I was afraid of Philip that moment I saw him. I hated him. But that's another matter. Something in his personality frightens me. I could have struggled against it and made myself say a lot of things. I thought of plenty of them. But it's because of principle with me to yield to my fear of people. I propitiate them, or I'm silent, or I avoid them." Mary looked at him very earnestly. "Have you ever loved anyone you were afraid of?" "Do you mean a woman?" She nodded. "I tell you I've never loved anyone, though of course I've made love to endless women. Oh, yes, yes. It would kill my love to be afraid. Not at once, but by inches and inches. Oh, yes. If I ever got thoroughly afraid of anyone in the end, I should stop loving them." She lowered her eyes and remained silent for a moment. Then she cried with a kind of quivering fierceness, "I won't have you dare ever to be afraid of me, John." He looked at her sharply. There was a note in her voice that he had not heard before. It was the danger note of that female beyond reason against reason. "Why not?" he asked. She turned away her head and looked across the wide, flat meadow at the Wissey bank, making no reply. A soft gust of south wind stirred the lighter branches of the ash above them. The cold, thin, smooth gray twigs, with their clean black buds, moved solemnly up and down like classic dancers. Shall I be pleased with Glastonbury?" he asked after a pause. "I believe you'll feel just as I do, John, about Glastonbury. You'll hate the sentimentality that has been spread over everything there, like scented church lamp oil. You'll hate the visitors. You'll hate the tradesmen catering for the visitors. You'll hate the sickening superstition of the whole thing." "I hate it now quite sufficiently," he interrupted, "simply because Philip's there. Oh, I wish—" He became so pensive that she did not like to break into his thought. "I wish, Mary, that you'd leave Glastonbury and try to find something of the same kind, whatever it is, that you do, somewhere around here." She smiled a broad, amused smile, showing off all her strong white teeth. "How funny," she murmured. "Why, my dearest, I can't do anything. You don't seem to realize that I've only been on my own for a couple of years. And before that I did nothing at all but look after Mother." Where did you live? In Thorpe, near Norwich. Mother's buried in Thorpe. She couldn't leave me anything because she lived on her pension. Mary's eyes opened very wide as she spoke of her mother. No tears came into them. They just opened very wide with a curious, self-conscious movement of the facial muscles. It was Philip, of course, who got me the place, she went on. Miss Drew is some sort of connection of Tilly's. She leaned forward now and stretched out her hand, caught hold of his foot. John, my dear John, she said with extreme and childish gravity, will you really walk all the way to Glastonbury? I shall start very early tomorrow, he replied, and I expect I'll see you again in 10 days. I suppose it all will be all right to send you a postcard when I get there? I shall anyway have a penny left to buy with them. Mary jumped to her feet and gave her skirts a vigorous shake. His question restored to her with a healthy rush her abrupt woman of action quality. Yes, she said. Send me a card. Miss Drew, the Abbey House, is the address. You won't forget that? You can think of the ruins for the Abbey part, and you can think of Screw for the rest. You, Screw, Drew, and she laughed uneasily. John slowly pulled up his legs and got to his feet. The hard, cautious, furtive look of a tramp was upon his face now. Will you really be able to help me keep body and soul together when I get there? And then shooting at her a completely impersonal look, as if she were a housemaid hiring him to chop wood. How often does she pay you? He asked. But Mary was totally undisturbed by this revelation of the lower self of her lover. Indeed, she looked pleased. Every month, she replied with shining eyes. It's my pocket money, you know. Her pleasure at the ungentlemanly turn he had given to the conversation brought such a glow in her cheeks, such a smile to her lips, that she became for a moment really beautiful. He rushed up to her and caught her in his arms. Long and long did he caress her until that Confederate ash tree. Long and long did he caress her under that Confederate ash tree. You're a hamadryad. That's what you are, he kept repeating. You're a hamadryad. Well, I think I'm going to leave it at that, since I'm fumbling a little bit on my words today. But that's a nice little lazy passage from Glastonbury Romance. Just hanging out on the river. Dreamily, lazily, lackadaisically, you could say, taking in the spring season. And soon they'll be in Glastonbury, I suppose. And more will be revealed then. So, till next time, cheers from Glastonbury.